Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the first webinar in our 2024 Research Policy Impact Series. I'd like to take a minute to tell you a little bit about the CTSC, or the Clinical and Translational Science Collaborative of Northern Ohio. We're a collaborative among Case Western Reserve University and its affiliated hospital systems, the Cleveland Clinic, Metro Health, University Hospitals, and the Lewis Stokes Veterans Administration Medical Center, Northeast Ohio Medical University, and the University of Toledo. We aspire to be a catalyst for high-quality clinical and translational science and transformative research to positively impact the health of those in Northern Ohio and beyond. Translational science focuses on the scientific and operational principles underlying each step of the translation process. Understanding these processes, identifying effective approaches, and removing barriers speeds the adoption of best practices into community settings and helps bring more treatments to more people more quickly. Translational science has many benefits, one being policy change and impact. And we learned about this from Washington University in St. Louis's Translational Science Benefits Model. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Khaliah Fisher-Grace. She will be sharing a bit about hospital policies. And she is a registered nurse with balanced clinical and leadership experience and a solid educational foundation. She is a dual career professional, serving 20 years in clinical practice alongside 12 years in nursing education. She previously held the position of Principal Advisor for Accreditation and currently serves as the System Director of Policy for University Hospitals Health System in Northeast Ohio. In both of these roles, she collaborated with teams to ensure sustained compliance with regulatory and organizational requirements. Dr. Fisher-Grace obtained both her Bachelor's of Science in Nursing and Master's of Science in Nursing and Healthcare Management from Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. She earned her PhD in Nursing from Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Using her experience, education, and voice to serve others, she is newly elected to the American Nurses Association Board of Directors and holds volunteer leadership roles in her local chapters of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and the League of Women Voters. And without further ado, Dr. Fisher-Grace, I will share your slides and you may have the floor.
Well, thank you and good afternoon, everybody. I'm very excited to be here and to kick off this series with a topic that's near and dear to my heart, work that I do every day. So I'll go ahead and just jump right into the objectives. So a few objectives for today are to define policy, discuss the importance of research, equity, accessibility, diversity, and inclusion, or READI, the program that has brought us together today. I'm also going to spend a little time reviewing key aspects of the National Commission to Address Racism in Nursing, their foundational report on improving equity in policy. And I don't want to lose anyone there because I'm talking about nursing, because it's actually related to any discipline, and especially if you are patient or family member. And then the final objective is really to review a hospital policy example. We're going to break it down and have some research considerations. So I just want to stress that while this webinar may be intended for those doing research, it's also intended for the community. You don't have to have a healthcare background to understand what is happening in your important role as a member of the community or someone who may obtain healthcare or have a family member who's a part of the healthcare system to listen and understand why this is important. So on the next slide, I just will bring you greetings from University Hospitals. I think Jalise shared a lot about my background, and University Hospitals, for those that may not be familiar, is a large health system in Northeast Ohio where I serve as the System Director of Policy. I'm excited to be here because I think this is my unique niche in the healthcare space. So I'll state the obvious again. I'm a registered nurse by license, a nurse scientist by educational preparation, and with my dual career in practice in academia, I think I'm qualified to talk to you about the important intersection of research and policy, and primarily how research informs or impacts policy and why ultimately diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging are so important in research that's going to impact our community. So I do invite you to place any questions that you have in the chat. I'll answer them at the end of the presentation. We'll have enough time. And also, if it requires it throughout the presentation, I'll stop and address if necessary. All right, so speaking of the chat, type in the chat what comes to mind when you hear the word policy. Now give everybody a minute. Okay, I see them coming in. Rules, guidelines, legally binding, governing. Requirements, good. So if I were to do a word cloud, or I did a simple word cloud just to bring together common terms that people think about, a lot of that are things that you have shared in the chat. Guidelines, or someone mentioned clinical guidelines, someone mentioned something that's governing, rules, things that you have to follow. We also want to think about things like evidence that drives policy. We might somehow think about leadership and their role in policy. And then you'll see these two little words that come up that have big and little. They're maybe difficult to see on this slide, but also I think just important to understand. So on the next slide, I would just say that most of what we saw in the chat is aligned with the common definitions that you'll find of policy. So for the sake of this presentation, I want to highlight a few common definitions that you might hear. I'll first start with Big P. Big P is what's considered public or governmental policies. So think of policies that a number of agencies might develop. You can think about things like laws. I think someone put in the chat, governing. So when you think of Big P, think big picture, someone in the public health space or an agency. And we'll talk a little bit about what those agencies might be. And then little p is often described as policies that are put in place by private or non-governmental agencies. So think about hospitals here, or health systems. So university hospitals, even though it's a large health system, it's still considered little p in the common policy definition. On this slide, I do want to highlight this image to the right. These are documents. This is our policy document. I've excerpted it from our policy on policies at university hospitals, and I'll talk through at least the policy definition. We define policy as a mandatory, high-level, overall standard to establish a course of action towards organization and enterprise-wide accepted strategies and objectives. We further define that system policies apply to all university hospitals entities. An entity-specific policy would apply to multiple departments within an entity. So when we say entity, oftentimes we're speaking of a hospital building, UH Cleveland Medical Center, but also we're a large health system. So an entity could also represent home care services. Whatever that entity is, they may have their own specific policies. And then we talk about department-specific policies. So they apply to a specific department or an institute. And why that becomes important in a large health system is because the work gets more complex, it can be more specific, and there may be things that occur at one entity that don't occur at another. But overall, there are some policies that all 30,000 plus employees need to be aligned around. So those are the definitions that I'm typically going to be working with when I'm presenting today. But there are a few other document types that you might have even brought up in the chat that we do recognize, different than policy, but still in that same framework of some sort of document that needs to be followed. So we talk a lot about procedures, and procedures being, we just define it as a set of formal steps to be followed consistently to accomplish a required activity or process. it's important to note that we state procedure is tied to policy and that they can be audience and or role specific. Guidelines, someone mentioned, we just describe guidelines as suggested best practices developed externally by professional societies or internally in a systematic manner by appropriate groups. Examples can be clinical practice guidelines, evidence-based guidelines, you name it. And then another thing that's probably important for this group, especially those that may conduct research, are protocols. We recognize the need for protocols in our organization, so we just state those as a system of actions that direct a clinical course in a specifically defined situation or treatment. Examples that are most common are COVID-19 clinical testing protocol. So one of the things that we like to remind people at UH is our policies impact patients across more than 1 million encounters annually. So policies support the care that we give. We see a number of patients through different visits all throughout the year. So over 1 million times, policies are influencing what happens or the outcomes that patients experience. So that being said, when you think about little p, it's not all that little. Organizational policies are very impactful, they're very important, and they're widespread. So as researchers, as those that have a public health interest, or even if you're a patient or a community member, it's just important to know that even at one entity or even within one health system, our policies are going to have significant outcomes for our community. So on the next slide, I just asked the question, why does this matter? If you've been in research, a lot of times what you hear is the question, so what? So why do we care? Why is this important? Why is this worth doing? Why is this worth pursuing? And so I mentioned that our policies within our organization can impact over 1 million patients or patient encounters annually. So now, if we frame that in the big P context, I think the need or why this important becomes a little bit more clear. So I have a short video by Dr. Don Berwick, who's the president emeritus and senior fellow of the Institute for Health Improvement, that I think kind of illuminates the importance of why we should care about policy. And so I will ask Jaleese to go ahead and click the video.
Consider that New Year's resolutions are not with that. As a therapist.
Hello, welcome to this first session of Policy and Evaluation in Public Health. This is the Investigate video, which will be followed by an Apply. Hello, and welcome.
What did you say, Khaliah? Sorry.
It's playing an advanced video. If you go back, I could see it to the right of the screen. And maybe I can drop it in the chat.
I think of improvement of care always in 4 tiers. I've thought this way for 20 years now. At the base are the interactions with people, helping this person live longer and better, whether it's through a web page or a physical exam and a medicine. That's the encounter. Then there's the microsystem. That's the day-to-day interaction. That's the doctor or nurse or pharmacist or receptionist that's working with people and the processes that allow you to do that safely, effectively, patient-centered way, timely way. It's the microsystem designs. That's IHI's sweet spot. That's where we've been for 40 years, thinking, what does that interaction look like? How do you have no pressure ulcer? How do you have no surgical mishap? How do you have true patient-centeredness? That has to do with the microsystem. Of course, they're now in organizations, and so we deal all the time with C-suites and chiefs of medicine and heads of nursing and organizational context, physical design, architecture, rule bases, budgets, all of that matters. And so that's why we focus on leadership in IHI, leadership of boards and C-suites. And what do you do to help improvement occur? The leaders should serve the microsystem so it can serve the patient and family. But those organizations, macro systems, they don't exist in a vacuum. They are strongly influenced by, I guess we'll have to call it policy. That's the world around them that's setting the rules, providing the resources and the way you get those resources, the payment system. They provide the training system. They provide the rules for certifying the professionals, what they need to know, and they provide the guidance for priorities. You can't ignore that. You can't say, that's above my pay grade or I can't work on that. You must work on that, because how can the environment be responsive to the organization so they can be responsive to the microsystems without interaction, without a chain of custody, chain of duty, chain of understanding? So I am arguing that we clinicians, we've just got to get involved more than we ever have before in that context setting. It has to do with creative molding of the arena of payment, regulation, training, environment for support of the care we want to give.
Thank you. So Don Berwick described 4 tiers of care improvement, and he described health policy as the environment that sets the rules, provides the resources, certifies the providers and organizations, provides the training, and sets the priorities. He also stated that the system directs the macro system, and the macro system supports microsystems, which serves the patients and families. So this hierarchy is an impetus for researchers in all disciplines and communities to engage in policy. Again, at the local level or the little p level, UH is a large health system, and we're seeing over 1 million we're having over 1 million patient visits. So that hierarchy is going all the way down. But what would we consider the healthcare environment? Who's at the decision-making table at the top of the pyramid? When we talk about big P or big policy, what's driving that? So I'm gonna advance to the next slide, but in the chat, I wanna ask you to name some of the organizations that you think influence the healthcare environment. So think big P. Who's telling university hospitals what to do? CMS, AHA, American Hospital Association, DMV, AHRQ. All the acronyms, they're coming through the chat. You can tell these are my people here. They know all the rules. So our boards of nursing, boards of pharmacy, our regulatory agencies, Leapfrog, you can see the names go on and on, the Ohio Department of Health. The image that you'll see come up on the screen now might be a little difficult to read, but it really reflects about 20 to 30 organizations that are under the Department of Health and Human Services. And believe it or not, even with this large number of agencies or offices on this screen, some of them break down and have even more institutes and centers underneath them, but you are right. All of these groups are setting the priority for healthcare. They're big P, they're creating big policy that is translating down to what is being done at the organizational level. So if you advance just one more slide, you'll see me highlight the National Institutes of Health, because I think this speaks to why I'm here today and kind of what Jaleesa already talked to you about, is really the work around translational science. So For the purpose of today's webinar, on the next slide, I want to just share a little bit about the National Institutes of Health. They have over 27 institutes and centers, and the National Center for Advancing Translational Science is one of those institutes. As Jalise already mentioned, this group or this center has a mission to turn research observations into health solutions more rapidly. So to get research, to get treatments, to get devices, to get medications into the community much more rapidly is really a goal at the national level. And so how that gets supported or advanced is through centers like we have in Cleveland that Jalise has already mentioned, our Center for Clinical and Translational Science, but also providing the funding for that and then supporting the research. The government recognizes the benefit of research for how it can help improve society overall. I think I would just go out on a limb, and probably no one would disagree with me, that research has been the single most important thing to help advance the human lifespan over many, many decades. So again, if you go to the next slide, I don't want to go much deeper into agencies, but I just want to be able to share a little bit about why these agencies exist and to try to just lay the foundation of the work that they are doing. Jalise has already mentioned that there are benefits to translational science. They group a lot of those benefits into these four groups that you see here: clinical, community, economic, and policy. So when you think about policy, and we're talking about big P, we're talking about CMS, NIH, those big agencies or departments under Health and Human Services. In this policy space, there's a lot of work that can be done at the national level or state level that's going to direct the work of a lot of people or create the requirements of a lot of people. So in that policy space, you see, if you're a researcher, there's an opportunity to have your research contribute to legislation, to different policies, to standards for accreditation bodies, any of those agencies that are there that have funding priorities. Your research can help support the work that ends up being done at the local level. And you can see there are many other benefits to this translational science model. On the next slide, I'll just briefly highlight some of the challenges as it relates to translational science and research in general. Many of us have heard about social determinants of health and have a general understanding that there are poor health outcomes that are linked to environmental and social factors. Another important thing to understand is that minorities are underrepresented in clinical trials. So what that really means is that health equity must be prioritized in research to ensure adequate treatment and inclusive policies are developed. And so I'm grateful, and I think maybe we would all say that we're grateful that in Northeast Ohio, we're rich in the resources of our health institutions, such as university hospitals and our universities, such as Case Western Reserve University, in that they work together to try to address the barriers that exist in research and getting the right representation in clinical trials through programs such as this, the READI program, and many, many other programs that they have. So if we are able to understand that these are challenges, then we also have to understand that there are some things that support these challenges or that cause these to be challenges. Issues of trust, issues of discrimination and or racism that continue to perpetuate when we're trying to get to treatments and trying to get to policies that would advance the health of different communities. So on the next slide, I think it's just important to pause and try to recognize that we have had inequities, but we're moving towards a situation or a system where we can uplift and elevate equity and make sure that when we have research that it is inclusive and also that it recognizes some of the historic issues and some of the problems that got us here. So I want to pause before I move into sharing the next video, just to say that some of the conversation in the next slide may be uncomfortable. It may be something that either you've heard before or you haven't heard before, but if in any way, any of the things that are shared in the video concern you, or they upset you, or they bother you, just please take a moment to take care of yourself, but also understand it's a difficult topic. So trying to uncover or start to learn a little bit more about things that have been done and how we can move that needle forward sometimes can be uncomfortable, even for me as the presenter, as I'm too learning myself. So on the next slide, I'm gonna share a video, but before we share it, I just wanna talk a little bit about its origins and how I got to this video. I mentioned that there's a National Commission to address racism in nursing, and that the work of that commission is relevant to all, it's available to all. But the work of that commission, some of the outcomes from that project, from that work included what's called Project Echo, or listening sessions, where we could talk about how do you eliminate racism in nursing. So I attended one of the sessions and I felt that it was transformative to me, and because I came across this video. And this video kind of called me to action in a different way, and I'll share that as we move forward in the presentation. But I think what I want to highlight is just that, to me, this video opened up my eyes to things that I could do in my own role to help eliminate racism or eliminate disparities within policy, because that is my lane. So I just wanted to share how I got to this video. It was through a series of education sessions, and Jaleesa, I'll ask if you can play the short video.
It's a word that's often used as a blanket term, but there's actually a whole lot more to it. There are 4 interlocking aspects of oppression: ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. And it might seem like a small difference, but it's very important to be able to distinguish between each kind, because understanding oppression is the first step to fighting it. Let's start with the core at the heart of every form of oppression: ideology. Every system of oppression comes from the idea that one group is somehow better than another. Ideological oppression starts when the dominant group associates positive qualities with itself and negative qualities with the marginalized or othered group. Ideological oppression describes the deeply ingrained social root of inequality. It's the larger overarching idea that leads to the isms. For example, the idea that black people are dangerous is ideological racism. The idea that poor people are lazy is ideological classism. Ideological oppression leads to institutional oppression. Institutional oppression is the way that systems and institutions manifest the dominant ideology. Institutions control access, who is able to get to what and how. This includes legal rights, police practice, access to medical care and education, public policy, political power, and media representation. For example, when women make 2/3 of what men make, that's institutional sexism. When a building is constructed without wheelchair ramps, that's institutional ableism. All of this leads to interpersonal oppression. Interpersonal oppression is probably the easiest to recognize because it happens all around us. Interpersonal oppression is the way that people play out discrimination and violence on each other. It can take the form of microaggressions, jokes, stereotypes, and harassment. For example, when a student is bullied for being gay, it's interpersonal homophobia. When a Muslim person is told that they're a terrorist, it's interpersonal Islamophobia. And all those forces, ideological, institutional, and interpersonal, lead to internalized oppression. Internalized oppression is the way that people with marginalized identities internalize narratives of their own inferiority. It's what leads people to feel less than. This is the end goal of oppression. The oppressive party doesn't need to exert force any longer because the marginalized group is enacting oppression on itself to maintain the status quo. It's important to remember that it's never a marginalized person's fault that they feel internalized oppression. It's simply what happens when someone faces negative stereotypes, low expectations, and ongoing discrimination. So, for example, an immigrant feeling embarrassed about having an accent is internalized xenophobia. When a trans woman feels that they can never be a real woman, that's internalized transphobia. So, to review, the 4 I's of oppression are ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. Each of these types are interconnected and completely supported by the others. They can never exist on their own and can even be seen as a cycle. Now that you understand the different kinds of oppression, you're even more equipped to fight it. Don't forget that any effort to dismantle oppression should aim to address it at all 4 of these levels. Thanks for watching.
So thank you for sharing the video, Jaleese. Now I'll just reflect and say, I watched the video so many times because there were things that I needed to pick up and go back and try to understand. And so I just encourage anybody to look up the 4 I's of oppression and reflect on it as often as you need to, because it was impactful to me. It may be of impact to you. So when I look at the, on the next slide, I'm on this screen, I'm just sharing the picture of the National Commission to Address Racism in Nursing's foundational report. They have a section that addresses how racism shows up in policy. And when you think about the 4 I's of oppression, the video clearly calls out the policy as a place where institutional oppression can occur. So this groundbreaking work, even though it's focused on nursing, as I mentioned, this is important for all communities to understand. If I didn't say it before, I will say it again. Nurses are the largest workforce across healthcare. So understanding what the national organizations are collaborating, combining, and calling nurses to be aware of is important for everyone. It's important for anyone who's in the research space, anyone who may receive healthcare, because you're going to be connected to a nurse at some point. So on the next slide, I'll let you look at what's listed here, but these are some key themes from the foundational report around racism, or how it shows up in policy. And I'm going to read a quote from the report, and where I use the word nurse, please feel free to substitute any discipline that you want to help make the context real for you. So in the report, it states that policymaking is ultimately about leadership, power, and decision-making authority. Who has the power to decide that a policy is needed and subsequently determine who is in the room to contribute to the development of the policy? And who decides what the final policy will be? There are policies that nursing controls, and there are policies developed by others that govern what nurses do. As a profession, nurses and nursing must commit to engaging in a fully informed policymaking process that's inclusive and not only considers, but also prioritizes equity and justice. 2 key conditions that contribute to the success or failure of the development and implementation of anti-racist policies are leadership and culture. What I like about the work of the commission is that their reports not only call out what the issues are through these themes, they also have affirmative key themes. So how do we move forward? You can see here that there are 3 themes that they highlighted. Of course, this isn't all. And while they're reflected on nursing, I brought them out in these slides because we're talking about policy, we're talking about speeding up research that can improve the health of communities, but we have to understand where some of these barriers can exist that don't get us the results that we need or intend. So the first theme that you can see when you think about policy is that racism is perpetuated through systemic and structural nature of policy. Another theme is that the application and implementation, whether through explicit or unwritten rules, can aggravate the racist impact of any policy. And then also, policies are going to reflect the voices that are in the room. lack of diversity or only token representation of individuals of color or representatives from impacted community preserves a singular point of view that the dominant culture is making of the policies. When you move past that or get over to the other side of this, and again, I'm giving you small bites of a landmark report, so understand that it's a lot to take in, and there's more information following this. But other things to think about when you're trying to move in a positive direction to address these issues is that equity and justice can also be perpetuated through systemic and structural nature of policy. Another theme is that the application and implementation of any policy are equitably administered and measured by equal outcomes across groups. And then that diversity of people and thought, plus the equitable inclusion of all stakeholders, will broaden the policymaking lens and support the development of anti-racist policies. And every effort must be made to amplify the voices of those most impacted by these policies. So that's a lot to take in on just 2 slides. And again, this is a full commission that's working around this. So I'm trying to summarize it quickly so that we can move through and just have a little bit more appetite to learn more about how research and policy and diversity, equity, inclusion can be aligned. On the next slide, I'm gonna bring it up a little bit in that we're getting close to the final objective, and before questions and answers, I want to bring it back to the little p, which again, talking about organizational policies. So I pulled up this, I created this slide that says policy everywhere, policy all the time. So those that are on the call that are a part of the policy team, they're very familiar with what these slides are showing. And in brief, it's just for you to have a little bit of understanding that we have software at UH that allows us to get information about policies. What types of policies are we developing? What types of policies are employees looking at? How often? What are those policies? What do we think that means? How many policies do we have? Are there any other things that we see? Do we have duplicates in our policies? How often do people access policies? So I just say that policies are everywhere and they're accessed all the time. This slide to the right is just showing, it looks like a little bit of a heartbeat, and we joke to say policy is the heartbeat, but this just shows how often policies are accessed across university hospitals. And I'll just tell you that during a weekday, any given day of the week, Monday through Friday, policies are accessed at UH over, on average, 650 times a day. So again, we're talking about little policy, little p, just one health system in order to support the work that needs to be done or the care that needs to be given 650 times a day during the week and a little bit over 80 times on the weekend. But every day someone is accessing policy. So the implications for researchers are real. The impact of policy is real. So when you reflect back on what we just talked about in terms of oppression, diversity, equity, inclusion, we have to think about that because the impact is evident when you look at how often people are looking at policy. So we don't want to have a miss in policy in any way, shape, or form because it will have a significant impact on our patients and on our caregivers. So I'll move to the next slide. And I'll just start this off with a little bit of a disclaimer. I am sharing some of our patient rights policy, and this is, it's not really intended to be provocative. I'm sharing it for multiple reasons. I think those that are on my team know that I'll go on a rant when it comes to patient rights, because this is something that I'm very passionate about. But also I'm sharing it because I think sometimes that if you're a member of the community or if you have gone in to get care, you don't realize this is the one policy that you're going to be given. You are going to be handed a copy of your rights, or you're going to have them very plainly visible when you go to a doctor's visit. But this is the one thing that I feel like people probably kind of just like throw away or say, oh, I'll put that over there and look at it for later. But these are your rights. And so I'm sharing this because, in my opinion, it's not that controversial, right? This is what your rights are. So I wanted to just have you look a little bit or look for a moment at what some of these rights are. This policy is saying that each patient has the right to a number of things. I cut it off on this slide at number 13. When we go to some of the other slides, you'll see patients have a lot of rights. So I think what I want to do in terms of an example as it relates to policy and patient rights in particular is just ask for you to comment in the chat, who develops patient rights policies? So put on your big P hat and your little P hat. Who do you think develops policies for patient rights? Doug has all the answer. Yeah, so a lot of people are saying CMS, leaders, the hospital is developing them. And a great question from Jaleese, what about patient and family advisory councils? So really the answer is everybody's rights. I think in the big P world, the rights are determined from the federal government or from CMS. They state what the rights for the patients are, but they also tell hospitals that we need to have a policy on patient rights and we need to have certain things in place. So then we take the patient rights and we put them in our own language. So some of the things that I cut out, which are very important, I just cut it out for presentation's sake, is really a lot about how UH as an organization, we respect patients' rights, we uphold them, we adhere to them, and some of those statements that are very important that we as an organization put into our policy to make it clear how this aligns with our mission, vision, and values. But it's true, all those people help create the hospital policy. Jaleese asked a really good question, and I think it leads to the next slide. So if we go to the next slide, we can revisit your question. So again, this is just more on your rights as a patient. Like I said, I cut it off at 13 on the previous slide, and here we are at 14, and we're going on and on and on in terms of the number of rights that you have. So some of the things that are listed here talk about having access to your information, your medical record, being informed of any policies and practices that relate to your care, having the right to consent to procedures, as well as the right to refuse care, to get care in a safe setting, to communicate with people outside of the hospital, to have your rights given to you in a language that you understand, to receive a copy of your rights and responsibilities, and to be free of restraints that are not medically necessary. So my question for you to put in the chat is, how might patient rights policies support equity, accessibility, diversity, and inclusion in research? How can this policy support what we're trying to get to in the research setting? And I know the question might be a little bit tricky, so I'll provide my little insight on it. I think, as I mentioned, people get this document and maybe it gets thrown in the trash. So I think maybe having more conversation with patients about, hey, you have certain rights. And do you know that when we do research, we won't violate any of your rights? I know that we talk about informed consent, but sometimes I think being aware of just hospital or health system policies is something that I see patients need a lot of awareness about, based on some of the behaviors that I see that occur on the back end when someone might enter into the healthcare space. So I think there are a number of ways that we could hang out the patient rights and say, hey, we're not going to do anything to violate you or to harm you. This is what we're committed to. We're sharing this with you. You can trust us. You can trust the care that we're providing to you. You can trust us if you want to participate in a research study, that you have a number of rights, even above the rights that might be a part of the consent that you give to participate in a research study. All right, and then the next slide, another example. It's my final example. Again, I just stuck with the same rights. But I think this gets to Jaleesa's comment. My question for the chat is, what stakeholders should be involved in developing patient right policies? And so I think you had mentioned something about patient advisory councils, and I agree with that. If we go back to some of the takeaways from the National Commission to Address Racism in Nursing, some of their key themes are that you need to have adequate representation. You need to have the right stakeholders present so that policy can be developed in a way that is inclusive. So I see the comments coming in the chat. A lot of people support that, you know, somehow patients, caregivers, families, a number of people that are impacted by the policy, either impacted because this policy is about me or impacted because I'm carrying it out. I'm a caregiver. I have to be aware of what your rights are so I can support you in getting the care that you need. So that's the last example that I have. And I know we're getting close to the hour, so I just have a few more slides. If you advance to the next slide, Jaleesa, I think what I would say, just the takeaway is really a call to action for everyone. Specifically for me, I mentioned I participated in the Project Echo series, and that was open to anyone, free to nurses. You didn't have to be a member of any other organizations. You did not have to be a nurse. We have patients that would be on those bi-weekly calls, and they're still available on YouTube and at least on the American Nurses Association website, if not others. But what I learned during those series of webinars was really what prompted me to action, to just say, we have to relook at how we address policy at university hospitals. And so after I saw that video and attended that Project Echo series, I immediately re-emailed our Director of Diversity, Ray Shalou, and said, Ray, we've been talking a while. I know you're just kind of getting your feet wet, but we really have to advance this conversation around equity, diversity, equity, inclusion, and policy, because I think we have an opportunity to really look at how those of us who have the responsibility to review policies understand and look critically through a DEI lens to make sure that we are doing our part to live out our mission, vision, and values, to be good stewards of the rights of patients, and that we're doing the best we can by our community. And so we're excited that from that conversation and from other needs that we have as it relates to policy within our health system, we're going to have our first internal training for kind of a specific group of experts within the organizations, those that serve on policy committees, those that help with the technology or the software to manage policy throughout their entities. And so our call to action was crystal clear that we have more work to do. And so that education is going to go forward in February for us. that's my call to action. That's what I think I can do. But I think the question for everyone on the call is, what is your call to action? What is it that you think you can do to make sure that across, if you have any input into the policy space, or if you are a researcher and you think that your research is going to be used to develop policy, either at the big P level or the little p level, what is it that you will do to make sure that your research is equitable, that there's diverse populations represented, that it's inclusive, that it has thoughts about accessibility and who's able to participate in the research and what that result is going to mean. So I'll leave you with that, and just on the next slide, I'll ask if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know in the chat.
We have a lot of thank yous. That was an incredible presentation, Dr. Fisher-Grace. Thank you so much. A lot went into that. Love the interactivity. That is fantastic. So that'll be a great model moving forward. We do have one question. Do you know if CMS is looking at this as it relates to their policies for hospitals?
That's a good question. I don't know, but I'll go out on a limb and assume that they likely are. We talked a little bit about like who sets the priorities. And so one of the things I saw on the clinical, on your website, was how health equity was a priority. So I think CMS at the top starts setting priorities. I would imagine that this has to be somewhere within their within a priority that they're looking at what their policies are. Are they equitable? Are they inclusive? So, and I also, I don't want to go into like too much history that people are like, you're weird and I don't care about that. But I would say that a lot of the things that kind of direct the work of CMS are things like the Civil Rights Act, things that are laws that they have to uphold and adhere to. So I would give them credit to say that they probably are doing something. I just don't know about it. But because they have so many rules and regulations that they have to uphold when we think about what our rights are, they're usually the ones that are kind of, I want to say, handing them down. So I would hope that at the top, they're looking to make sure that what they hand down is equitable. Good question, because now I need to go and figure out, like, what are they doing in there? If you can tell me something, give me some insight.
Any other comments, thoughts, questions? While we have a couple of minutes before we officially end, we hope that you'll join us next month on February 22nd. From noon to 1, we'll hear from Dr. David Baker. He is the Executive Vice President for Healthcare Quality Evaluation and Improvement, Editor-in-Chief of the Joint Commission Journal on Quality and Patient Safety. And he'll be talking about the Joint Commission standards for healthcare equity accreditation. And of course, all things have the translational science, translational research overlay. So we'll be getting his insights on that as well. Thank you again, Dr. Fisher-Grace. And if you have any questions for the CTSC or Dr. Fisher-Grace, please feel free to reach out. We're happy to field those. And we hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.